Part of your picture assignment, your image assignment, has to do with digital darkroom techniques. At least in going through and manipulating a few of the photographic variables in a way of your image. And so I'm using iPhoto here. I use iPhoto all the time for about everything that I do, just to go through and kind of do a little bit of housekeeping in terms of exposure and contrast and saturation. I don't know a whole lot beyond that, but I can show you how things work. And I have an image here that is representative of kind of a tough exposure in that we have some shadows here where the kayaks are laying. And then we have the highlights in terms of the lake in the background, the sky back there. And my camera's done a pretty good job in trying to go through and finding a median exposure here in terms of preserving some detail here in the shadows while being able to also preserve a little bit of detail, at least in the highlights. But I could use just a little bit more here. And if I were writing a blog, say, about kayaking, I would want to go through and punch this a little bit in terms of maybe pulling out some more detail and maybe working the exposure a little bit. So I wanted to show you how those work here in real time in terms of making adjustments. This is a histogram where I can go through and take a look at RGB hues, values, and stuff in terms of their levels in saturation. I'm not going to worry about that with you. Get into my photojournalism class when we get a little more heavier into the histogram, but here I'm not going to get into it a whole lot. I have these sliders here in terms of my being able to go through and manipulate exposure, contrast, saturation, and then these things having to do with overall image quality. Let me explain what these are, though, to begin with. Exposure has to do with the overall exposure of the image. Now, I'm assuming that your camera it has the ability to go through and create an exposure where highlights and shadow are treated in a way that we're able to go through and identify really kind of a medium range of exposure that looks natural to the human eye. Okay, so while I can't exactly duplicate that, if I were standing here like I was looking at this scene with the kayaks, the sky was bluer and I had more detail coming out of the green in terms of my foreground. And the eye has the ability to go through and adjust for that. Cameras, not so much. Some cameras do. Some of your higher end has that ability. And then certainly Photoshop or iPhoto or anything can come through and make some of those some of those compromises. I'm just going to slide the exposure slider here and go overexpose. And if you see by doing that, I'm able to get more detail out of the kayaks there, but obviously a lot less detail out of the sky. Its values are representative of a stop. That would be a full stop of overexposure right there where I lose everything in the background, but now my foreground's coming up. I'm going to go the other way and underexpose it. So I'm going to go halfway underexposed, and my sky's coming in, but now I'm losing some of my color saturation. And if I go all the way down to one stop underexposed, or at least according to those values, that's what I'm looking at. So the camera actually did a pretty good job, or I should say I did okay in terms of doing the exposure on this because I was able to go through with my camera and look at shadow and look at the highlights and try to get a good compromise for both of those. So I'm going to revert that back to the original. In terms of contrast, if I want to bump the dark and lights in that, that's what contrast does. So I'm going to take them down actually with this. I'll slide it down and you see what's going on. I start to lose that detail. Things start going into more shades of gray with that as opposed to going the other way. Now my lights are getting lighter, my darks are getting darker, and I don't really like that either. So I'm going to actually just kind of keep that there. Contrast does well if we're shooting an image that has a low contrast exposure, and this one it's very high contrasty, so I'm not going to be using that at all. In saturation, if I want to boost my colors a little bit, I can go through and bump that up. You see as they get, at some point, the reds go a little too harsh with that, and the blues as well. It's just not believable or real. If I underexpose it, I can take it all the way down and desaturate. I like the way desaturation looks for some photographs. And for something that has a real dominant color like this one does, the desaturation actually looks pretty good. Or I could take it out all the way and go into black and white. Now watch what happens when I'm black and white when I go through and increase the contrast. Not as much as I wanted to see in terms of the water in the background. Sometimes pulling chroma out will go through chroma being color, will go through and allow me to pull some other types of contrast. But this is still pretty contrasty as it goes. So I'm going to revert that back to original. Definition gets into in terms of image clarity within its pixels. If you watch the grass area here in the foreground, I'm going to hit definition, and I want that more defined. And so you see it becomes more detailed. It's tweaking the actual pixels as we go. As I go back and forth, it looks kind of blurry. You didn't realize it was blurry to begin with, did you? Highlights gives me the ability to control highlights. And since my sky is my highlight in this, there's not a whole lot going on. I can bring that down a little bit bluer. I actually kind of like that, where I'm bringing the highlights down. In terms of shadows, if I wanted more detail in my shadows, I could bring this up, so it brings my shadows up within that. Now I'm getting more to an evened out exposure in terms of contrast with this by taking my shadow values and my highlight values and boosting them. Okay, take a look at that, and then we go back to the original and see what I'm talking about. Okay, so there's more detail coming out in the highlights in terms of the sky. Okay, going a little bluer, and the detail on the hills and mountain range in the background. And shadows, as I bring that up, yeah, now see, now I'm correcting, and that's starting to feel a little bit better for me, for my eye. I like what's going on. Sharpness has to do with detail. I like on something like this, nice and sharp detail going on. I'm not going to worry about denoising. And that's pretty well it. I could go through and save this image that way. I've done some digital darkroom correcting, and that's what I'm kind of asking you to do as well with your images, is to take something that it might not need it, but as you go through and start to play around with it, you might see that there's some improvement that could be made. Temperature and tint. Temperature has to do with the temperature of light that we're dealing with in degrees Kelvin. I won't worry about that so much. You can get into my other classes where we get into something more technical that way. Tint has to do with color, and I'll save that one as well. You can go through and correct tint. So, for example, if you took an image that is too tungsten, like this is here, I can move that back into a middle value and get into a proper color balance with that. That has to do with white balancing and some other ideas, and I'll spare you for that. Right now, for this class, in terms of intro to new media production, I really want you to be able to play around a bit with exposure, contrast, saturation, and then get into working your highlights and shadows, okay? So this is kind of a landscape we've been talking about. I'm going to revert that back to the original so you see what's going on there. I could also get into, there's some quick fixes here, one of which being cropping. If I wanted to go through and do a bit of cropping, there's a number of ways I can crop. I want to constrain this to the aspect ratio that I got going on here, and I can pull that up. What I like about this, when you bring up the cropping icon, it gives you that rule of thirds going on. So I have it there, and then I want to go through and put that rule of thirds right into that. I still have a little too much foreground going on. Let's go. Let's try that and see. We'll go call that done and see what it does. Okay, that's a little more interesting. Looks better. Now let me go back and readjust what was going on here in the shadows and the highlights. So pull shadows up and pull highlights, and I like that a lot. I might just do a little bit of contrast thrown in on top of that. You might think that overrides what I'm doing, but just a little bit's going to go a long way. Maybe we could saturate it just a smidge as well. There. And I think that's about all I'll do with that. And there we are. It's an improved image over what it was that we had before. Let me go back, take a look at that. Let me go back to the original, and Bob's your uncle. So let's look at one more here. I'm going to go back to a portrait session that I did with my daughter. She just graduated from the University of Oregon in architecture, and she was looking to go through and put together a profile pic for her LinkedIn page. So we decided to look for a place that had strong architectural aspects to that. For us, that worked out to be the Capitol, just down the road from me, up in Salt Lake City, with with the pillars in the background and this architectural granite piece here coming to. We thought we'd use these as some kind of structural elements. I had my wife along with me, going through and using a bounce fill going back into that, so you see her in the frame here. Now when I'm shooting, a lot of times I'm shooting the whole frame, and I know I'm going to go in and probably crop a little bit, so I'm not really minding the fact that she's there. Let me show you what I'm talking about in terms of cropping. This is, let me go into the edit mode with this and show you. Well, the first thing I can do here in terms of cropping is take this out. So I'm going to go into crop. Again, I'm going to keep it probably, I'm going to constrain it to that size. And I want the bridge of Katie's nose to really fall onto that rule of thirds right there. And that, I like that, what that's doing. I might want just a little bit more room in there. And she can go through and crop this too for whatever she might end up doing, especially if she uses this for a LinkedIn post. I like that. So we'll call that good. Okay. Not a whole lot to do with this image in terms of its color saturation and things. And I'll play with that a little bit to show you what I'm talking about. The contrast is right there. If I boost that up or if I take it down, I start to lose some detail elements in there that I don't want to lose necessarily. So it does okay. Exposure is fine, saturation. Watch what happens. So this box is checked to avoid saturating skin tones. And as I go through and saturate everything else around her, okay, iPhoto knows to stay away from the natural skin tones that she has. So watch what, see it saturate behind her, bring the blues in. That's the kind of the blue light that we were dealing with there. Watch what happens when I desaturate, though. It doesn't know how to treat her lips in terms of that natural skin tone. Okay, she's got a real red lipstick going on that pops the lips, and I really like that a lot. But iPhoto doesn't know how to treat that. It's like, wait a minute, is that a skin tone or is that part of the background? If I uncheck that, okay, as I go through and saturate, you see how her whole skin tone becomes saturated. So if you want to go through and pop what's happening around your subject, but don't want to pop their skin tones themselves, you can sure go through and check the box and go through and leave it as it is. Like I said, not a whole lot going on here. Let me get into shadows a little bit. You're going to see some detail come out of her jacket. And again, I really don't care about that. The highlights as well. I really like what's going on highlight-wise, so I'm not going to touch this. There's not a whole lot to be done with this, as you see, as I'm sliding that back and forth. Sharpness, definition, denoise. I could pull definition and start popping that pillar to her right, but I start seeing a little bit more of definition noise happening in her face. See that going on there? So I'm not going to worry about that. I want it on a little bit on the soft side there. All right. So I have an edit here dealing with basically cropping skin tones and everything. It looks really good. It's about right where I want it. I do believe that I have an effect that's on this image. Let me go into there and see on edge blur. Oh, well, I don't. Well, it says I have a 1 edge, but I'm going to take that out. So watch the edges around here. I would just like that to kind of go away maybe and focus in a little bit on her. Nothing real big. Okay, that's a +1 edge blur. I'm going to take that out. That's a 0 edge blur. +1, +2. I can get a little carried away with this and turn that into an entire vignette. And I don't want to do that. So I'm going to leave that there at a +1. And I'm done really with this. I've been able to go through and just improve this to a point to where it goes up into her portfolio. This is what that looks like, actually. Let me, I got it right here. So I can, sorry, the cropping on this is a little off, but can I move that into, there we go, okay. Yeah, so you can see. So this is the end product of everything that we did here. And so the manipulation that I did with this is across the board in terms of anything having to do with the crop or the highlight shadow. Some I didn't have to crop. Some I came in real tight on. This one became her LinkedIn profile image that way as well. But it captures what's going on in terms of the architectural elements in the background and also captures her personality and gets into her professionalism as an architect. And again, these are digital darkroom techniques that I'm using to go through and just enhance or improve something that already started off pretty well there. And that's what I'm asking you to do, to demonstrate a little bit of your digital darkroom technique, not take it overboard to where it's unbelievable. And there are ways to go through and do that. And there are other software applications where you can go through and do that as well. You are the creator here, and for your blogs and to tell the stories that you want with your images, be creative, just to keep it within the realm of taste and design principles in terms of what it is that you're doing. All right, see you later.